At the crack of dawn, as the airplane prepared for takeoff, the excitement of a long-awaited first-class experience filled the cabin. Jordan, a thoughtful and responsible 15-year-old who had always looked out for his younger brother Zavian, clutched his boarding pass with both pride and nervous anticipation. The spacious cabin exuded a welcoming American charm with its familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee and the gentle hum of quiet conversations, while the polished floors and smooth rolling suitcases gave the space a comforting, upscale feel. Yet, in an instant, this sense of security was shattered by a cold, unyielding force. A stern flight attendant named Meliora Cartwright, known for her strict adherence to rules and a reputation built on efficiency over empathy, suddenly stopped before the two brothers in first class. Her eyes narrowed as she examined them with a look that mixed suspicion with disdain, and before anyone could understand what was happening, she had them escorted off the plane in a manner that left them both humiliated and isolated. Jordan could hardly believe what he was witnessing. Just moments earlier, the brothers had been celebrating a surprise reward from their father, a set of coveted first-class tickets earned through hard work and stellar grades. The thrill of sitting in such comfort, the luxury of oversized seats, and the pride of being recognized for their achievements had filled them with joy. Now, that very joy was replaced by a crushing sense of betrayal and unfairness. Meliora's actions were more than a mere mistake. They were a deliberate, heartless display of authority. It was as if she relished the opportunity to assert her power, disregarding the innocence and excitement of two young boys who had done nothing wrong. Her rigid enforcement of what she perceived as protocol, without any attempt to question or understand the situation, widened the gap between the gentle hope that first class once symbolized and the harsh reality that now lay before them. The confrontation deepened as Jordan and Zavian were led away from the familiar comfort of their seats, their every step accompanied by disapproving stares and whispered comments from fellow passengers. Jordan's heart pounded with a mixture of anger and despair as he watched his little brother's eyes fill with tears. He felt an overwhelming need to protect Zavian from the cruelty of a system that seemed determined to belittle them. The air in the cabin, once warm and inviting, now felt heavy with judgment. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, while some deliberately avoided eye contact, as though the incident were too painful or too shameful to acknowledge openly. For Jordan, each step away from the plane was a painful reminder that even in a world designed for comfort and courtesy, cruelty could suddenly and inexplicably surface. As they were escorted down the narrow aisle by Meliora, joined by another crew member named Bennett who carried an air of authority yet betrayed his discomfort, the true extent of the injustice became clear. "There's been a mistake with your seating," Meliora stated in a tone that was neither apologetic nor gentle. When Jordan mustered the courage to protest, insisting that they had valid first-class tickets, his voice wavered between defiance and despair. Instead of offering an explanation, Meliora's eyes flashed with a cold determination that spoke of an unyielding commitment to her own interpretation of the rules. Her treatment was not only unnecessarily harsh, it was executed with a cruelty that suggested she derived satisfaction from causing pain. Every word she spoke, every curt gesture she made, deepened the emotional rift between herself and the vulnerable boys, casting a long shadow over what was meant to be a celebratory journey. Once outside the plane, in a small seating area near the gate where the bustling energy of the airport seemed a world away from their personal nightmare, Jordan and Zavian sat in stunned silence. Jordan's mind raced as he replayed every moment, questioning how an act that began with such promise could descend into such a display of cold indifference. The distant murmur of travelers and the constant movement around them only heightened his feelings of isolation. His protective instincts surged as he looked at Zavian, whose small frame now trembled with the weight of humiliation. The harsh treatment they had received felt like a betrayal not just by an individual, but by an entire system that prized rigid order over human decency. In that crowded terminal, surrounded by strangers who offered nothing but fleeting glances and muted sympathy, Jordan's heart ached with a profound sense of injustice. It was not merely about losing seats. It was about the cruel realization that even in moments meant for celebration, cruelty could seep in and rob them of their dignity. The situation escalated further when a series of messages from their father, arriving on Zavian's phone, offered little comfort and only served to underline the gravity of the situation. With each message, the weight of the injustice grew heavier. Jordan's mind, already swirling with anger, now brimmed with a quiet determination. A determination fueled by the stark contrast between the warmth of their family's love and the callous behavior of those in authority. He couldn't shake the image of Meliora's icy glare and the way she had treated them, as if they were nuisances unworthy of compassion. The cruelty of her actions was magnified by the indifferent responses of the airline staff and the unspoken agreement among passengers to let the incident pass without protest. In that moment, Jordan realized that this was not an isolated mistake, but a symptom of a much larger problem. A system that valued rules over human empathy and where the vulnerable were left to suffer in silence. The drama reached a new level of intensity when the unfolding scandal caught the attention of higher management. It turned out that the two boys were no ordinary passengers. They were the sons of the airline CEO, Darius Langford. This revelation sent shockwaves through the ranks, stirring up a storm of discontent and forcing the issue into the spotlight. Captain Aldrich Vaughn, known for his steely composure and unwavering professionalism, was now thrust into the middle of a crisis that threatened to unravel the very fabric of airline operations. Summoning Meliora to the cockpit for an explanation, Captain Vaughn's measured tone belied the severity of the situation. Inside the cockpit, the air was thick with tension. Meliora, who had previously executed her duties with an almost mechanical detachment, now found herself facing the full consequences of her actions. When Captain Vaughn demanded a clear account of the seating issue, her words fell flat against his unyielding stare. Instead of offering a sincere explanation, she clung to her rigid justification that the boys were alone and therefore unqualified to occupy first class. Her response, delivered without any hint of remorse, only served to highlight the deep chasm between her cold enforcement of policy and the raw human suffering she had inflicted. In that moment, as the cockpit doors closed behind her and the reality of the incident sank in, the true cost of Meliora's unyielding cruelty became painfully apparent. Jordan, though physically distant from the tense confrontation, felt every word and every cold glance as a personal blow. The entire ordeal was not simply a bureaucratic error, it was a profound betrayal of trust, a stark reminder that sometimes those entrusted with care and order could become the very source of heartache. The bitter irony of the situation, compounded by the knowledge that his own family's honor was at stake, left Jordan feeling isolated and deeply pained. Yet, in the midst of his sorrow, there flickered a resilient spark of defiance. He vowed silently that the injustice he had experienced would not be forgotten, and that he would one day seek to change a system that allowed such cruelty to thrive. By the time the murmurs of the terminal resumed and the passengers gradually returned to their routines, Jordan's inner resolve had transformed his pain into a quiet promise, a promise to stand up against the indifference and harshness of a world that too often let cruelty go unchallenged. His experience that day, marked by a single, heartless decision made by a woman who cared little for the consequences of her actions, had irrevocably changed him. It was a lesson in the fragility of fairness and the profound impact that even a momentary lapse in compassion could have on the lives of the innocent. As he looked over at Zavian, still quietly recovering from the ordeal, Jordan's determination to fight for a kinder, more understanding world grew stronger with each passing moment. In that crowded, impersonal terminal, amidst the steady rhythm of announcements and the ceaseless movement of people, two brothers found themselves united not just by blood, but by a shared desire to reclaim their dignity in the face of a merciless system. This unforgettable incident, as painful and bewildering as it was, became a turning point in Jordan's life, a moment that underscored the importance of empathy over rigid bureaucracy, of understanding over unyielding adherence to outdated rules. Even as he sat in those uncomfortable chairs near the gate, the memory of that day continued to haunt him, a constant reminder of the cruelty that can hide behind a facade of efficiency. Yet, despite the deep sorrow and the bitter sting of injustice, Jordan's story was also one of resilience and hope. It was a story that spoke to the quiet strength found in those who, despite being battered by life's harshest realities, never lose sight of the possibility of redemption and change. And as he prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, Jordan carried with him the unwavering belief that compassion and understanding, once kindled, could transform even the coldest of hearts, and that someday, the cruelty he had endured would give way to a brighter, more humane future. In the quiet tension of the cockpit, Captain Aldrich's stern gaze never wavered as he addressed Meliora. Her lips parted slightly, yet no words came, and his jaw tightened in disapproval. "Did you verify their tickets with the gate agent?" he asked slowly, his tone heavy with disappointment. For a long, suffocating moment, Meliora stood there, feeling the weight of his words, the air in the cockpit suddenly thick with apprehension. "I looked at the tickets," she managed to say in a softer voice, trying to defend herself. But before she could continue, Captain Aldrich's head shook disapprovingly. "You didn't verify, you assumed," he replied firmly. His words cut deep, and Meliora felt her throat constrict as the truth of her oversight sank in. Then came the crushing revelation. The two passengers she had forcibly removed from first class were none other than Jordan Langford and his younger brother Zavian Langford. The captain's voice grew colder still as he continued. "Do you know who their father is?" The question hung in the air like a dark cloud. Meliora's pulse raced, and a chill ran down her spine when Aldrich revealed that their father was Darius Langford, the CEO of the Airline. In that moment, the gravity of her mistake became unmistakably clear. "Right now, Darius Langford is personally reviewing this situation," Captain Aldrich intoned, his voice like steel. "You have single-handedly created an incident that will not only affect this flight, but could result in severe consequences for the entire airline." Meliora could only swallow hard as the magnitude of the disaster she had wrought pressed down on her. Captain Aldrich's next words were measured and deliberate. "You will return to the boys, personally apologize, and escort them back to their original seats in first class immediately." His command brooked no argument. Meliora opened her mouth, ready to protest that she had merely been doing her job, yet the look in Aldrich's eyes silenced any impulse to defend herself. "Do I make myself clear?" he demanded. And with clenched fists and trembling resolve, she forced a reluctant nod and whispered, "Yes, Captain." "Then fix your mistake," he ordered, turning away and leaving her alone with the crushing realization of her error. As soon as the cockpit door closed behind her, she exhaled slowly, her hands still trembling with a mixture of fear and shame. Down in the cabin, passengers continued to settle into their seats, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just erupted behind the scenes. However, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. Meliora walked stiffly down the aisle, her heart pounding as if trying to escape the consequences of her actions. She had handled difficult passengers and strict supervisors before, but nothing in her long career had prepared her for the humiliation that now followed her every step. When she stepped back into the first-class cabin, the energy had changed. Every eye was on her, every whisper a reminder of the incident that had just taken place. The boys, whose names now would be remembered not just as victims of an administrative error but as symbols of an unforgiving system, sat waiting. Zavian sat with his arms crossed, his eyes glued to his phone, while Jordan, whose calm exterior belied the hurt and indignation roiling inside, sat upright, his expression unreadable. They had barely exchanged words since receiving a terse message from their father, yet the silent communication between them spoke volumes. As Meliora approached, she forced a tight, almost painful smile and knelt to meet their eyes. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said in a strained, measured tone. "I would like to escort you both back to your original seats in first class." Zavian raised his eyebrows slightly, his eyes questioning her sudden change of heart, while Jordan's gaze was fixed, demanding an explanation. "Now you want us to come back?" Zavian asked quietly, and Jordan pressed further. "What changed?" Meliora's jaw tightened as she struggled to maintain her composure. "It was an error in seating," she explained quickly, avoiding their eyes. "I apologize for the inconvenience." Zavian blinked in disbelief and repeated, "A mistake? But you saw our tickets." Jordan's voice was firm as he added, "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket, you only looked at ours." In the hushed silence that followed, every passenger seemed to lean in a little closer, straining to catch every word. Meliora's face flushed as she tried to regain control of the situation, a control that had long been hers but was now slipping through her fingers. "I may have misjudged the situation," she admitted at last, forcing herself to sound composed. "But I would like to correct it now." The boys exchanged a look that spoke of wounded pride and deep embarrassment. "You didn't just misjudge," Jordan stated evenly. "You embarrassed us in front of everyone." The accusation stung, and Meliora's eyes darted nervously around the cabin as the weight of public humiliation bore down on her. She longed to end the conversation quickly, to dismiss the incident as a simple misunderstanding, but the moments stretched on, each second a painful reminder of her failure. The passengers, who had earlier pretended not to notice, now paid rapt attention. A woman in seat 3D shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flitting between Meliora and the boys, and a man in seat 4A adjusted his tie as if to brace himself for further drama. The uncomfortable truth was undeniable. Everyone had seen what had transpired, and no one was willing to let the matter go unchallenged. Zavian, leaning back with crossed arms, remarked casually, "Dad told us to take our time." Jordan, his expression hardening, added, "Maybe we shouldn't be in a hurry at all. Maybe we should make sure we actually belong here first." Hearing this, Meliora's stomach tightened, and she struggled to keep her voice steady. "I understand if you're upset," she said carefully, "but I need you both to return to your seats now." Zavian, his phone still in hand, countered sharply, "Maybe I should ask Dad first." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, and whispers rippled through the cabin as they realized the full extent of the situation. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Meliora stepped back and replied stiffly, "Of course. I'll give you a moment." Turning on her heel, she headed toward the galley, her hands cold and clammy, and for the first time in her career, she felt completely powerless. In the galley, she paused and gripped the edge of the counter, her breathing shallow as she tried to steady herself against the tide of disapproval echoing through the cabin. Meanwhile, Jordan leaned over to Zavian and quietly instructed him, "Send her a message." Zavian nodded and quickly typed a message. "She wants us to come back." When a reply came from their father instructing, "Make sure she understands what she did and don't move until she actually apologizes," a small defiant smirk crossed Jordan's face. The balance of power had unmistakably shifted. Across the cabin in the economy section, Jordan and Zavian remained seated with a calm that belied their inner turmoil. Jordan leaned back against his chair, tapping his fingers lightly against the armrest, as if waiting for justice to be served, while Zavian scrolled through his phone with a smug air. Zavian then read aloud a message from their father. "She made a decision, and now she needs to live with it. Don't move until you receive a proper apology." Jordan's eyebrows rose at the words, and Zavian grinned, clearly enjoying the role reversal. Back in the galley, Hahima, a younger flight attendant who had been quietly observing the entire debacle, hesitated before approaching Meliora. "Are you okay?" Hahima asked with genuine concern, but Meliora's response was sharp and defensive. "I don't need your concern, Hahima," she snapped, her pride wounded. Hahima held up her hands in surrender and softly replied, "I was just asking." Leaning against the counter, Halima's eyes conveyed a mix of disappointment and sympathy as she watched her superior unravel in front of everyone. Meliora tried to distract herself by busily organizing a tray, muttering, "It was just a misunderstanding." Yet Halima's skeptical scoff cut through the pretense. "Misunderstanding? You didn't question a single other person in first class, just them," Halima observed bluntly, and Meliora's grip on the tray tightened with barely concealed anger. "Let me guess," Halima continued, "you thought they didn't belong. You assumed something without verifying." Meliora's silence was all the response Halima needed before she sighed, shaking her head. "I've worked under you long enough to know you hate being wrong, but this is a whole different level of bad," Halima remarked quietly. After setting the tray down with a bit too much force, Meliora turned toward the aisle, determined to reclaim some semblance of control. "I already spoke to them," she muttered, but Halima wasn't convinced, folding her arms and asking, "And how did that go?" Meliora shot Halima a glare, then strode purposefully back down the aisle toward Jordan and Zavian. As she reached them, the boys barely moved, their expressions resolute. Clearing her throat, Meliora asked, "Are you ready to return to your seats?" Jordan, resting his arms comfortably on the armrests, replied in a calm yet cutting tone, "Are you ready to actually apologize?" The question hung in the air and Meliora stiffened. "I already said it was a misunderstanding," she protested weakly, but Zavian raised an eyebrow. "That is not an apology." The silence that followed was heavy with disapproval. Meliora hated feeling as though she had lost control of the situation, but the truth was undeniable. Their father's message had given the boys the upper hand, and neither would budge until she offered an apology that carried genuine remorse. Forcing herself to maintain an even tone, she met their steady gaze and admitted, "I shouldn't have assumed you weren't supposed to be in first class. I was wrong. I apologize." Zavian's head tilted slightly as he pressed, "For what exactly?" Meliora's jaw clenched, and with a strained voice she replied, "For questioning your tickets and for making you leave your seats." Finally, Jordan nodded and pushed himself up from his chair. "That's better," he said quietly, a mixture of relief and lingering hurt in his tone. As the boys slowly returned to their first-class seats, the entire flight watched them, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene. Jordan adjusted his seatbelt with deliberate care while Zavian whispered, "Dad's going to love this update." Meliora turned to leave once more, but Jordan's calm yet firm voice stopped her. "Oh, and Miss Cartwright," he said, his expression unyielding, "if you're going to apologize, make sure it's not just because you got caught." For a long moment, Meliora met his gaze, her face burning with humiliation and regret, before she turned away to retreat to the galley. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, burdened by the knowledge that the whispers and stares of every passenger would follow her. As she reached the galley and leaned against the counter, trying to steady her ragged breathing, Halima's presence still lingered nearby. The day's events had shifted something fundamental in the cabin. For the first time in her long, unyielding career, Meliora was not the one issuing orders, not the one in control. And in that loss of power, a deep, painful empathy stirred among the passengers. A quiet understanding of the cruelty that can emerge when a person's humanity is overshadowed by blind adherence to rules. In that moment, as she inhaled deeply and prepared herself for the inevitable whispers that would resume once she stepped out, Meliora knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret O'Connor's hands trembled as she tried to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond what she ever expected on a routine flight. A few moments earlier, while a colleague wore an amused expression and half-joked about her handling of the incident, Halima had asked in a low, cutting tone, "So how did that go?" Margaret shot her a sharp look and murmured, "Not now." Though her voice quivered with the weight of what had just happened, Halima leaned casually against the counter, arms folded, and said, You still don't get it, do you? Margaret exhaled slowly as she reached for a stack of cups, pretending to busily arrange them, but her shaking hands betrayed her inner turmoil. In that moment, Halima's words stung like a rebuke. You pulled 2 kids out of first class based solely on your own assumptions. Then you forced them to walk back through the cabin as if they had committed a crime. And now you think a simple apology will erase all of that? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line as she turned away, feigning interest in organizing napkins while inside regret and dread battled with every heartbeat. Halima's tone, though harsh, carried a note of pity that made the sting all the more painful. I don't need a lecture, Margaret mumbled under her breath, but deep down she knew the lecture was inevitable. Halima tilted her head toward first class and added, because you know who else isn't going to let this slide? You know it's Darius Langford. The mention of his name sent a fresh wave of heat rushing to Margaret's cheek. This was no ordinary mistake that could be brushed aside with a casual report or a half-hearted warning. This error involved the CEO's very own sons, and the consequences were about to unfold in the most unforgiving way imaginable. Back in first class, young Zavian pulled out his cell phone, his fingers tapping rapidly as he updated his status, while his older brother Jordan observed with a mix of amusement and reserved satisfaction. She finally apologized, one of them noted in a tone that was both sarcastic and edged with hurt. Took her long enough, the other remarked, his voice laced with defiant satisfaction. In a matter of seconds, a text arrived from their father instructing them to remain calm and wait for further instructions. Zavian read aloud with a self-assured smirk. Dad says, sit back and relax. I'm handling the rest. Jordan raised an eyebrow as he glanced at Zavian's phone, silently questioning whether Margaret truly understood the gravity of her actions and the storm that was about to hit her. At the front of the plane, the in-flight phone buzzed unexpectedly. Margaret froze as the other flight attendants turned to watch her, their expressions a mix of worry and anticipation. Halima gave a slow, knowing nod that signaled this call was far from routine. With trembling hands, Margaret reached for the phone and lifted the receiver to her ear. A deep, calm voice soon emerged. This is Darius Langford, the voice announced, measured and chillingly calm yet laden with an unmistakable warning. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Mr. Langford, she began, forcing herself to keep her voice steady despite the panic building inside her. Before she could elaborate, Darius interrupted. You removed my sons from first class without properly verifying their tickets. You did not check, you assumed. His words struck Margaret like a bolt of lightning, and her throat constricted painfully. Sir, I understand I made an error, she stammered, barely able to meet his steely tone. You do not understand. Darius interjected sharply. If you had verified, this conversation would not be taking place. His voice carried a weight that made the confined space of the cockpit feel unbearably small. Margaret clutched the phone tighter as silence fell between them, every second stretching into an eternity of regret. Desperately trying to salvage what little dignity she could, Margaret continued, I have already apologized to them and escorted them back to first class. Darius's reply was cold and unyielding. And? Do you think that forced apology can undo your mistake? He asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was a mistake, a misjudgment, Margaret managed to say, her voice growing softer and more uncertain with every word. No, Darius replied, his voice lowering to a dangerous murmur. It was a choice. You did not verify the manifest, you did not call the gate agent, and you did not stop to consider the consequences of your own assumptions. My sons have followed every rule and have their valid tickets. You allowed your bias to humiliate them, and in doing so you have not only tarnished our company's reputation, but also put your entire career at risk. With each word, Margaret felt the full force of his scorn pressing down on her, leaving her hollow and exposed. Darius's tone then turned even more menacing. Do you understand what happens next? He asked, and Margaret could hardly breathe as the silence that followed enveloped her like a shroud. I expect a full incident report as soon as this flight lands. I want to know exactly what you were thinking when you decided that my sons did not belong in first class. You will explain yourself in front of the executive board, the very board that determines whether you keep your job." His words were delivered with such finality that Margaret felt as if her life was crumbling around her. "I suggest you use the rest of this flight to think very carefully about how you will justify your actions," Darius concluded, and then the call ended with a single resounding click. Margaret stood frozen, the receiver still pressed against her ear as the low hum of the disconnected line echoed in her ears. She could barely move as the reality of what was coming sank in. Halima's eyes met hers with a mix of pity and disapproval. Slowly, Margaret placed the phone back on its hook, her hands clammy and shaking, and without another word, she turned and made her way to the nearest restroom. Inside the small, cramped space, she locked the door and leaned over the sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was not the confident, composed flight attendant who had spent 15 years devoted to her job. Instead, she saw a pale, distraught figure, overwhelmed by the consequences of a single, fateful decision. Margaret splashed cold water on her face, each drop a reminder of her failure and the harsh reality of her mistake. She had humiliated the sons of the most powerful man in the airline industry, and now she was left to face the dire repercussions. The cold water did little to wash away the shame that clung to her, and as she stared at her own eyes, she realized that this was not just about one error. It was about every time she had allowed her assumptions to override her duty to treat every passenger with fairness and respect. And now, because of one terrible miscalculation, everything she had built over years of hard work was hanging by a thread. A sharp knock on the restroom door startled her, and she flinched as a familiar voice called, "Margaret, we need you back out here." It was Bennett, the senior flight attendant, his tone low and grave. With a heavy heart and a mind swirling with dread, Margaret unlocked the door and stepped out. Bennett's expression was unreadable, but the tension in his eyes was unmistakable. "We just got word from ground control," he said in a hushed voice, guiding her away from the other crew members who watched silently. "Security is waiting at the gate when we land." The word security reverberated in her mind, sending fresh waves of panic through her. "Security?" she whispered, barely audible. Bennett nodded. "Not for an emergency, but for an escort. Langford himself made a personal request," he added, lowering his voice further so only she could hear. Margaret's stomach twisted violently at the thought. This was serious. More serious than she had ever imagined. Bennett continued quietly. "They are calling a review hearing immediately after we land. That does not happen unless the company is considering serious action." Margaret's throat tightened as the magnitude of her situation settled in. 15 years of dedication to the airline, years of service and loyalty, were now at risk because of one impulsive decision. She turned her gaze toward first class, where Jordan and Zavian sat comfortably, scrolling through their phones as if nothing had happened. Their calm demeanors, though not overtly gloating, spoke volumes. They felt vindicated, their eyes holding a quiet, steady defiance that cut deep into Margaret's heart. Halima stepped closer, her arms folded and her tone both sympathetic and scornful. "It's starting to sink in now, isn't it?" Margaret clenched her jaw in response, feeling the sting of every word, as if it were a personal indictment of her entire career. For the next 30 minutes, every second dragged on with excruciating slowness as Margaret stood near the galley, gripping the counter and staring blankly at the service card in front of her. Her mind raced with frantic thoughts of possible explanations, excuses, anything that might soften the damning reality that awaited her. But no matter how hard she tried, there was no escape from the harsh truth. She was about to be held accountable in a way that could end everything she had worked so hard for. The crew, including Halima and Bennett, exchanged somber glances as they moved around her, their silent stares a constant reminder that judgment was already being passed. Then, over the intercom, the captain's calm yet firm voice broke through the heavy silence, announcing, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent." With that simple statement, the final moments of the flight began, and Margaret knew that her life was about to change forever. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. We will be landing shortly. As the gentle announcement echoed through the cabin, Margaret O'Connor inhaled sharply. She knew there were only 20 minutes left before touchdown, and with a heavy heart, she stole a glance toward first class. There, young Eliane and Zavien sat comfortably, their expressions unreadable. They had not spoken a word to her since she had forced them to return to their seats, yet she could feel their eyes on her. Not with spite or anger, but with the quiet confidence of two boys who already felt victorious over her unjust decision. In a hushed murmur, Zavian leaned toward his older brother and whispered something before unlocking his phone. Margaret's stomach dropped as she caught sight of him typing another message. She instantly recognized that he was texting none other than Darius Langford, the very man whose authority now loomed over her. Margaret shuddered at the thought of what message might be sent. She knew that whatever he told his father would only deepen the consequences she now faced. A few rows behind, a well-dressed businessman in seat 4A adjusted his tie with evident discomfort. He had been one of the silent witnesses to the unfolding drama earlier, choosing to remain silent until now. As Margaret passed his row, he finally muttered, almost as if to himself, "I hope you learned something from this." His tone was low, and he didn't even look in her direction. At the same time, across the aisle, a woman in seat 3D, the one who had questioned Margaret's decisions earlier, shook her head and said softly, "The world is changing. You should have changed with it." Margaret felt a rush of heat flood her face. It was no longer just about Darius Langford. Now every single passenger on this flight knew what she had done. They were not simply waiting to see what punishment awaited her at landing. They were expecting it. The seatbelt sign chimed on again, and Margaret moved stiffly back to the galley. She gripped the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white, each second ticking by like a step closer to the inevitable reckoning. Standing beside her was Halima, her expression a mixture of disapproval and pity. "Still think you can handle it?" Halima asked quietly. Margaret couldn't bring herself to answer because, for the first time in her long career, she wasn't sure she could handle anything at all. The plane dipped lower as it prepared for landing, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin with a deceptive calm. Passengers began to adjust their seatbelts. Some stretched in their seats, while others craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the approaching runway through the window. For most, it was just another flight coming to an end. For Margaret, however, it felt like the beginning of the end. She stood in the cramped galley, clutching the counter so hard that her fingers ached. Each passing second, a reminder that punishment was imminent. In her mind, she could already picture the scene. Walking off the plane with security waiting, the hushed whispers of airline staff trailing behind her as she was led aside. Would she be fired on the spot? Would she even be given a chance to explain herself? The reality was that there was nothing left to explain. The gravity of her mistake had settled deep in her bones. Margaret had made a decision based not on policy or procedure, but on a hasty assumption, and now she was about to pay for that choice in front of everyone. In first class, Eliane casually adjusted his seatbelt while keeping his phone in his lap, clearly waiting for that final message from his father. Zavian, on the other hand, appeared to be enjoying the unfolding drama. With a slight smirk, he scrolled through his phone, already imagining the moment of retribution when they landed. "Think he's waiting for us?" Zavian asked, nudging his brother gently. Eliane nodded, replying coolly, "Definitely, and I don't think he's alone." Zavian's grin widened at the thought, and Margaret's stomach churned as she overheard their playful banter. It was a crushing blow. She could hear them saying, even if only in whispers, that she was about to have the worst day of her life. From her post in the galley, Margaret heard the boys' conversation and felt her anxiety spike. Halima, ever observant, noticed the way Margaret's face paled and her body tensed at the sound of Zavian's voice. With a dry laugh, Halima remarked, "You're scared." Margaret's eyes snapped to her in a silent rebuke. As the plane continued its final approach, Halima raised an eyebrow and gestured toward first class. "Because those two," she said softly, "they're not worried about a thing. They're sitting back, relaxing, knowing that their dad is about to handle this in a way you never saw coming." Margaret's pulse quickened at those words. "I've been in difficult situations before," she tried to remind herself, but Halima's response was unyielding as she tilted her head. "And how many of those situations involved the man who owns the airline demanding an explanation for why you publicly humiliated his kids?" Margaret had no answer. In that moment, the entire cabin seemed to grow eerily silent as the plane made its final approach. Passengers straightened in their seats, gripping armrests, as the aircraft hovered just above the tarmac. Then, with a smooth landing, the wheels touched down with a gentle bounce and the engines roared softly as the plane began to slow. For most passengers, relief washed over them as the overhead lights flickered and a few let out sighs of gratitude that the flight was over. For Margaret, however, the landing signaled the beginning of a nightmare. Almost immediately after the captain's steady voice announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate," Margaret caught sight of the jet bridge moving into place through a small opening in the galley curtain. Standing just outside the window was a group of men in dark suits. Her breath caught in her throat. They were not ordinary airport security, nor were they random executives. They were personal staff from the CEO's office. Darius Langford's own men, waiting for her. In first class. Murmurs erupted as Eliane glanced out the window and smirked, while Zavian let out a quiet chuckle, whispering, "Oh yeah, she's done." The fastened seatbelt sign soon dinged off, signaling that the plane doors would open. Margaret realized with a sinking heart that she now had nowhere to hide. Bennett, the senior flight attendant, approached her with a blank expression and an unreadable voice as he said, "They're waiting for you." Her pulse thundered in her ears as she forced herself to take a steadying breath. She had always prided herself on her authority, on being the one in charge, but now all that power felt like a distant memory. As the seatbelt sign finally turned off, a hush fell over the plane. Normally, passengers would rush to stand and collect their belongings, but this time no one moved immediately. Every passenger seemed to sense that something momentous was about to occur. Margaret's hands turned ice cold as she gripped the service card in the galley, trying desperately to steady herself and think of what she could possibly say. What defense could she offer when the man waiting for her owned the very company she had dedicated her life to serving? Through the small window in the galley door, she saw 3 men in dark suits, arms crossed and earpieces in place, standing just outside the jet bridge. They were not ordinary airline staff. They were Langford's people, and they were here for her. One by one, passengers began to stand, gathering their bags and stretching, yet their eyes remained fixed on the front of the plane. The tension was palpable. Eliane took his time unbuckling his seatbelt as if savoring every moment of this unfolding drama, while Zavian, already standing, casually rolled his shoulders as if he were getting ready for a show. "I can't wait to see her face," Zavian muttered to his brother, to which Eliane smirked in silent agreement. From her vantage point in the galley, Margaret heard every word, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she felt the full force of panic surge through her. Bennett appeared beside her and said in a measured tone, "You need to go out there." Margaret did not move at first, her heart pounding in defiance of the inevitable. Bennett exhaled sharply and added, "Look, avoiding it isn't going to change anything. You made a bad call, and now you have to face it." Margaret clenched her jaw and tried to protest, "I was doing my job," but Bennett's long, exhausted look said it all. Before she could muster any further words, the cabin doors unlocked with a quiet hiss as the jet bridge fully connected. A uniformed security officer stepped in first, followed closely by a man in a charcoal suit, whose calm, commanding presence instantly dominated the small entryway. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's eyes widened in recognition. It was Dorian Vance, Langford's right-hand man, the head of airline operations, and the one responsible for quelling internal crises before they erupted into public scandals. He was here for her. Dorian stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping the cabin before settling on Margaret. The very moment their eyes met, her stomach dropped and every passenger seemed to stare. The flight attendants fell silent, and Dorian's voice, smooth yet stern, broke the heavy silence. "Ms. O'Connor, you will need to come with us." His words were polite but carried an unyielding finality. Margaret's fingers balled into fists as she felt every single eye in the cabin fixed on her. Halima watched from a distance, with folded arms and an unreadable expression, while Bennett shifted uncomfortably at her side. Even the passengers, some of whom had pretended not to listen, now watched with a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. For one fleeting moment, Margaret considered making a scene, arguing that she had only been following procedure, insisting that this was all a misunderstanding, but she knew deep down that Dorian was not interested in excuses. Without another word, she stepped forward. As she did, whispers erupted throughout the cabin like a rolling tide. It was clear to everyone that she was being escorted off the plane. Passengers parted as she walked down the aisle. Some refused to meet her eyes, while others murmured among themselves. In first class, Eliane sat calmly, watching her with an inscrutable expression, while Zavian smirked, not out of cruelty, but because in his eyes, justice had finally been served. As Margaret neared the front of the plane, she hesitated and turned her head slightly to glance back at first class, where the two boys now sat in the seats that had once been hers to judge. She had been so certain that they did not belong there, and now she was the one being forced to leave. Dorian motioned toward the jet bridge with a curt nod, saying simply, "After you." With one final, trembling breath, Margaret stepped off the plane. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the cabin erupted into a flurry of whispers. An unspoken tension had shattered the stale silence, and every passenger felt the magnitude of her fall from grace. Some exchanged knowing glances while others muttered softly, piecing together what they had witnessed. Margaret had been removed, escorted off her own flight in a public spectacle. Halima, still lingering near the galley, let out a slow breath and shook her head, softly remarking, "Wow." Bennett ran a hand down his face and sighed. That was brutal. In first class, Eliane adjusted his watch with calm indifference, while Zavian, his smirk widening, remarked under his breath that it was clear she was done. In that final moment aboard the plane, as the security team led Margaret away, she could only stand in stunned silence, her once confident demeanor shattered into 1,000 pieces. The humiliation of being publicly exposed and condemned by the very people she had once served was a weight too heavy to bear. Now, with every step toward the jet bridge, she was forced to confront not only the wrath of a powerful CEO and his staff, but also the stark realization that her life, her career, and her very sense of self had been irrevocably altered by one thoughtless decision. Margaret O'Connor stood on the jet bridge with her heart pounding and her mind reeling from the events that had unfolded during the flight. As she took slow, measured steps forward, she could still hear the low, mocking whispers of the two young boys, Eliane and Zavien, back in first class. Zavian had leaned toward his brother and whispered that every moment of this debacle was worth it. Eliane had smirked in quiet triumph. They had seen her downfall coming, even though she had once believed that she held all the power. Zavian had even said, in a tone that chilled her to the bone, that she never truly had any control at all. Eliane had tapped his fingers on the armrest and casually remarked that their father was not finished with her yet. Zavian raised an eyebrow and asked in a hushed tone if their dad would fire her. Eliane had paused thoughtfully and then shrugged, adding, "I think he'll make sure she never forgets this flight." Those words echoed in Margaret's ears as she continued her slow, reluctant journey toward the terminal. Outside the plane, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Margaret could feel the imposing presence of Dorian Vance trailing behind her with deliberate, measured steps. His presence was as heavy as lead, And although he never raised his voice or appeared overtly angry, every step he took reinforced the reality that Margaret had lost all control. At the far end of the jet bridge, 2 more men in impeccable suits waited for her, one clutching a tablet and the other a thick fold. The sight of them made her breath catch in her chest. She knew that this moment was inevitable, and that the consequences of her actions were now crystal clear. As soon as she reached the open terminal, Dorian stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Without a hint of raised volume or anger in his eyes, he stated smoothly, "Ms. O'Connor, you will come with us to the executive office." Margaret's throat tightened as she forced herself to take a deep breath, her voice barely audible as she managed to ask, "Am I going to be given a chance to explain my side?" Dorian did not blink for a moment as he replied in an icy tone, "You will be given a chance to submit a formal statement, but I would choose your words carefully." Margaret clenched her fists, feeling the raw sting of his authority. She had dedicated 15 years of her life to this airline, and now, with a few cold words, her entire career was under attack. Dorian's face remained unchanged as he continued, "Today, in a single flight, you damaged the company's reputation, alienated premium passengers, and made a decision that has now reached the highest level of corporate review." His tone was so measured it was almost clinical, but the cruelty in his words cut deep. He tilted his head slightly and added, "That is impressive in a way, as if her mistake were a calculated move rather than an error born of poor judgment." Margaret felt her stomach drop. She had expected consequences, maybe a suspension or a quiet reprimand, but never this public spectacle. Never had she imagined that she would become a living example of corporate failure. With a curt motion toward a nearby corridor, Dorian said simply, "Let's go." Margaret hesitated for just a fraction of a second, knowing that her future hung in the balance. She had no choice but to follow him. As she walked forward, Dorian and the 2 suited men flanked her silently. They never touched her or pushed her, yet the message was unmistakable. She no longer held any power. Meanwhile, back on the plane, the remaining passengers were still murmuring about what had transpired. An announcement over the speakers declared, "This is your captain speaking. We have now reached the gate. The crew will begin deplaning shortly. Thank you for flying with us today." In first class, the boys, Eliane and Zavien, continued to exhibit an air of calm superiority. Zavian, who had joined their quiet ranks, stretched his arms and remarked casually, "Guess it's time to go." Eliane nodded as he grabbed his backpack and stood up, glancing briefly at the remaining flight attendants, none of whom dared meet his eyes. As they made their way toward the exit, a few passengers stepped aside respectfully, offering small nods of acknowledgement. It was not merely about what had happened with Margaret. It was about a deeper, unspoken rule in this world, that no matter how hard people worked or how much they earned, there would always be someone ready to question whether they truly belonged. Today, someone else had been forced to answer for their actions, and everyone had seen it. Stepping off the plane, Margaret encountered a familiar figure waiting at the terminal entrance. Tall and commanding in a sleek charcoal suit, Darius Langford, father to the 2 boys, stood with his hands casually in his pockets. Zavian grinned broadly and Eliane smirked as they exchanged knowing glances. As they walked forward, the moment their father's eyes met theirs, it became clear that this confrontation was far from over. Darius Langford exuded a quiet intensity that needed no loud words to command attention. Behind him, several corporate executives and senior airline staff waited, their faces etched with unease. They all knew exactly why they were there. Eliane and Zavien walked forward at a measured pace, carrying the calm confidence that their father had instilled in them. They did not appear nervous. They did not have to be. When they reached Darius, he gave them a long, measured look and simply asked, "You good?" Eliane nodded, replying, "Yeah." Zavian, with a subtle smirk, added, "More than good." Darius held their gaze for a moment longer before turning his attention to the group of nervous executives standing behind him. One man, a bespectacled fellow with silver rims, stepped forward to apologize on behalf of the airline, but Darius silenced him with a raised hand. A heavy silence fell over the terminal as onlookers, both airline staff and passengers passing by, began to steal glances and murmur among themselves. It was not every day that the CEO of the airline personally intervened in such a matter. After a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, Darius finally spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I want to make something very clear, not just to my staff but to every person in this airport. This is not about two boys being removed from their seats. This is about the fact that no matter how much success, education, or wealth you have, there will always be someone who decides you do not belong here." A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably, but none dared interrupt. Darius turned his gaze back to his sons and continued. "Today, that someone was one of my employees, and today, that someone learned that accountability applies to everyone." Zavian grinned and Eliane smirked even as they absorbed every word. Darius then addressed the executives once more. "I expect a full investigation into not just this incident, but the overall training of all crew members. I want a report on my desk by tomorrow morning. And if I find out that this is not an isolated issue, then the next person losing their job will not be a flight attendant. It will be someone in an office." No one dared speak as Darius finally turned back to his sons and said, "Let's go." With that, he led them away, leaving a trail of whispered conversations in his wake. Inside the stark modern conference room of the executive office, Margaret sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. The long glass table before her was flanked by two senior airline officials who were busy flipping through a thick folder, a folder that contained every detail of the incident. The weight of their judgment was palpable, and Margaret knew that she was no longer seen as just any flight attendant. She was now regarded as a liability. The serious-looking executive, Nathaniel Clark, fixed his sharp, unreadable gaze on her. "You've been with this airline for 15 years, he stated evenly. "Not a single major complaint on your record." Margaret nodded stiffly and managed a quiet, "That's correct." Nathaniel leaned back and then continued, "And yet today, you made a call that resulted in you being removed from your own flight by corporate security." Swallowing hard, Margaret replied, "It was a mistake." Nathaniel's eyes did not soften as he repeated, "A mistake." Margaret's voice trembled as she admitted, "I misjudged the situation." Nathaniel then exchanged a brief glance with another executive, Amara Wells, who tapped a neatly manicured nail against the table. In a smooth yet firm voice, Amara asked, "Did you ask anyone else in first class to show their tickets?" The silence that followed was excruciating. Margaret's hands tightened into fists under the table before she finally murmured, "No." Nathaniel sighed and tapped the folder. "You did not verify the manifest. You did not check with the gate agent. Instead, you assumed that two unaccompanied young black boys in first class did not belong there." He closed the folder with a finality that made Margaret's heart sink. "That is not a mistake, Ms. O'Connor. That is a decision." Margaret's mouth went dry. I did not mean it like that," she stuttered, but Amara interjected sharply. "You did mean it, because you never questioned anyone else. You did not pause. You did not think twice. You saw them and decided." Her breathing became uneven, and Nathaniel leaned forward, his tone stern as he said, "You were one of the most senior flight attendants on that flight. That means you set the example, and today, the example you set was that rules only apply to some people." The room spun with the weight of his words as Margaret felt a deep, overwhelming nausea. For years, she had enforced every rule and procedure without hesitation. Now, she was being held accountable for showing that those rules were not universal. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "We are still reviewing how this will be handled, but I can tell you this much. Your future with this airline is uncertain." The cold weight in her chest grew heavier. Amara then glanced toward the security officer standing by the door and said simply, "Escort Ms. O'Connor off the premises for now." Margaret's throat constricted as she realized she was not merely suspended or written up, she was being escorted. Slowly, with shaky legs, she stood up. The security officer, a middle-aged man with a neutral expression, opened the door for her. The moment she stepped out, it felt as if she were no longer a flight attendant at all, but the very embodiment of the failure that had humiliated the CEO's sons. The biting cold air outside the corporate office felt foreign and unwelcoming, and Margaret's movements became stiff and robotic. Her entire career, the life she had built over 15 years, was crumbling before her eyes. As she stepped onto the bustling sidewalk, the bright afternoon sun stung her eyes, and the sounds of the city honking cars, chattering pedestrians seemed indifferent to her downfall. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and for a split second she considered ignoring it, but curiosity won out. When she pulled it out, her heart sank as she read the breaking news headline: Airline executive Darius Langford addresses first-class incident involving his sons. The first image on the article showed Darius Langford standing resolutely in the airport terminal with his sons by his side, a stark reminder of the power she had so gravely upset. In that moment, Margaret realized that her fate was sealed. Not only had she lost the authority she once wielded, but she had also become a public example of what happens when someone in a position of trust makes a catastrophic mistake. The cruelty of the system had left her exposed, and the bitter judgment of those around her ensured that she would never forget the price of her error. Margaret O'Connor always prided herself on being in control. For 15 long years she had flown countless routes, enforcing rules with a steady hand and a confident smile. But on that fateful morning, as the plane taxied for takeoff and passengers settled into their seats, everything changed in an instant. Two young boys, Eliane and Zavien Langford, had been rewarded with first-class tickets, a rare privilege for anyone, let alone for kids whose father was the airline's powerful CEO. Yet Margaret, burdened by her own rigid beliefs and unyielding assumptions, made a decision that would soon unravel her carefully built reputation. As the flight attendant in charge, Margaret noticed the boys seated alone and, without a word of verification, assumed they did not belong there. In a heartless moment, she led them out of the luxurious cabin, leaving behind a scene that was at once both humiliating and bewildering. The boys' faces, which had once shone with excitement at the prospect of a special treat, now were filled with quiet defiance and hurt. Passengers watched in silence as Margaret, with an air of cold efficiency, escorted them out. In that instant, a divide was drawn. A divide between the rigid enforcer and those who deserved dignity simply by being who they were. The atmosphere in first class changed dramatically. Eliane and Zavien sat down again, their expressions unreadable but their eyes sparkling with a secret satisfaction. They whispered to each other, their voices low and determined, that Margaret had made a terrible mistake. Soon messages were sent to their father, and word of the incident began to spread like wildfire. The once comfortable cabin now pulsed with a quiet rebellion as passengers exchanged glances that spoke of both pity for the boys and silent judgment for Margaret's callous action. Back in the cockpit, Captain Aldrich called Margaret into the front. There, in the tense confines of that small space, he demanded an explanation. His tone was measured but carried a weight that made Margaret's heart sink. Instead of admitting an honest mistake, she tried to defend her actions by insisting it was a simple misunderstanding. But when the captain revealed that the boys were none other than the CEO's sons, and that their removal was now under the direct scrutiny of Darius Langford himself, Margaret's voice faltered. The realization hit her like a sledgehammer. She had not only humiliated two innocent children, but had also jeopardized the reputation of the airline and, with it, her own future. Forced to return the boys to their seats, Margaret's apology was as mechanical as it was public. The boys, already buoyed by the knowledge of their own worth, rejected her feeble words. They demanded a sincere acknowledgement of her error, and in doing so they turned the tables completely. Their quiet defiance resonated with the other passengers, who began to see the incident not as a minor mix-up, but as a stark reminder of the cruelty that can arise when assumptions override empathy. Then came the call that Margaret had dreaded. Over the in-flight phone, a deep, calm voice announced, "This is Darius Langford. You removed my sons without verifying their tickets. You assumed they did not belong in first class." Margaret's throat tightened as she tried to muster an explanation, but Darius was not interested in excuses. His words were cool and unyielding, each one a blow that stripped away the remnants of her authority. "I expect a full incident report as soon as we land," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Explain exactly what you were thinking when you decided my sons did not belong there." With that, the call ended, leaving Margaret trembling and alone with her guilt. When the plane finally landed, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to electric. Passengers in first class exchanged knowing glances as they watched Margaret being escorted off the plane by corporate security. The jet bridge became a stage for public humiliation, a stage where Margaret, once a figure of authority, was now a cautionary tale. As she walked down the aisle, every step felt heavier than the last, and the whispers of the onlookers echoed in her ears like condemnations. Outside, at the terminal, the reality of her actions hit her full force. In a quiet corporate office, a group of executives assembled to review the incident. Margaret was led into a modern conference room with high ceilings and sleek glass tables, where the room's chill was matched only by the cold expressions of those present. Nathaniel Clark, a stern executive with a reputation for fairness and rigor, looked at her with piercing eyes. "You have been with this airline for 15 years without a single major complaint," he said evenly. "Yet today you made a decision that resulted in you being removed from your own flight." His colleague, Amara Wells, added sharply, "Did you ask anyone else in first class to show their tickets?" When Margaret could only whisper a reluctant no, Nathaniel's disappointment was palpable. "You did not verify the manifest, nor did you check with the gate agent. Instead, you assumed that two young black boys did not belong in first class. That was not a mistake, it was a decision." His words cut deep, leaving Margaret with a profound sense of shame and regret. Meanwhile, the Langford family was processing the day's events in the comfort of their luxurious estate. In the back of a sleek black car, Darius Langford, with his calm authority and measured tone, addressed his sons, Eliane and Zavien. "She humiliated you," Eliane remarked quietly, "and if I hadn't stepped in, she would have gotten away with it. Today, that woman made a choice," he said slowly, "and now she must bear the consequences. But remember, real power is about moving forward without seeking revenge." His words were a lesson in dignity and the importance of letting the truth speak for itself. His sons, though satisfied with the justice served, understood that this was not a moment for triumph but for learning the hard truth about accountability. As the evening fell, the Langford family arrived at their estate, a haven of modern elegance and warmth. They stepped out of the car and, with a quiet determination, embraced the new reality. For Darius, Eliane, and Zavien, the events of the day were a reminder that no one should ever have to prove their worth. Their victory was bittersweet, a clear signal that fairness and respect must prevail, even in a world rife with prejudice and blind assumptions. Back in the harsh light of the public eye, Margaret wandered the city streets, her every step a reminder of what she had lost. The cold afternoon air offered little comfort as she grappled with the fact that her once respected career was in ruins. She was now a headline, a living example of what happens when someone in power lets their personal bias override common decency. The news article that circulated made it clear. No one should have to prove they belong where they already are. Those words would haunt her forever. In the quiet solitude of her thoughts, Margaret felt a crushing isolation. She had been a woman of authority, someone people listened to and respected. Now, she was reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the price of cruelty and unchecked assumptions. With every breath, She felt the weight of her decisions pressing down on her like a crushing burden, leaving her to wonder if there was any hope of redemption. As the screen fades to black, remember to like this story, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.